Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming to tonight's Planning Commission meeting. I'll ask Commissioner Newman to lead us all in the Pledge of Allegiance.
And ready to begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Brenda. Can we have roll call, please?
Chair Baldino.
Here.
Vice Chair Newman.
Present.
Our new Commissioner Keldor.
Present.
Commissioner Wingate. Here. And Commissioner Heschler.
I'm here.
All right. Now's the time for public communications. This is the opportunity to address the dais on anything that's not already on the agenda. Okay. Seeing no one, we'll close public communications and move on to the consent calendar. Anyone want to pull anything on the consent calendar?
Nope.
All right, I'll accept the motion.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. We'll skip call items. Written communications, what do we have today?
There are items that I submitted, but those are on the agenda, so there's nothing.
Okay. All right, that brings us to new business. We're here for the Smoky Hollow Specific Plan Update Project. And can we have a staff report, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the Planning Commission. We're here to present you on the Smoky Hollow Specific Plan. I would just like to I'll let you know that we have a kind of a long presentation tonight for you. We gave you a lot of material to review and we have a lot of material to go over. So I would like to ask you, as you do every time, when things come up that you want to ask questions on, you can stop us and let us know as we cover different topics. That way we don't have to, you know, go back and remember a question and so forth, okay? And that'll make it a more productive and interesting session. Thanks.
Sounds good.
So with that, first off, I want to just give you and the audience a sense of the location and the boundaries of the specific plan. First off, the boundaries of the proposed specific plan are in that solid blue color, and the boundaries of the existing plan are in that yellow color. The differences are that some parcels highlighted here in blue are being added into the specific plan boundaries, and then some parcels are being removed. These parcels right here are properties that were developed with multifamily residential uses, and they're being removed from the plan and are proposed to be rezoned to R3. Next slide will just give you a little better sense of the proposed boundaries of the plan. And they also give you a sense of the differences between the two sides of the specific plan. On the west side, there's smaller parcels, smaller buildings, and then on the east side, there are rather larger parcels and larger buildings. So I'll go into give you a little bit of background on the specific plan. After World War II, this area was developed primarily as an industrial district. It was intended to serve the refinery and the aerospace industries in the area. So it had a lot of small and medium-sized sort of manufacturing facilities, parts suppliers for those major industries. Later on in the early 80s, there was sort of a reduction in the demand for manufacturing, and the City Council in 1986 adopted a specific plan whose purpose was to preserve those remaining industrial uses in the area and potentially attract new small and medium-sized industrial uses. Later on, after 2000 and around 2005, we've all noticed that there was a shift in the economy and the market away from the traditional manufacturing uses, and there was sort of a reduction in manufacturing, an increase in service, office uses, internet-based companies, high-tech media companies, and so forth. Well, that shift in the overall economy affected our region, starting from Santa Monica and then Culver City and Playa Vista, the area that we now call Silicon Beach. And of course, the same trend gradually made it to El Segundo and to Smoky Hollow specifically. And partly because of the city's location near the airport, near major industries, and also due to the competitive real estate prices here in the city. So one of the things that came with that trend was the existing regulations in Smoky Hollow did not accommodate that sort of expansion, that transition towards creative office uses. So it was challenging for businesses to move to Smoky Hollow, or those already in Smoky Hollow to expand and improve. So the staff at the time made efforts to make some changes to, for instance, allow more office uses in the Smoky Hollow area. We lifted some of the restrictions about 8 years ago, and then we followed up with adding some flexibility in the parking standards. Introduced the ability to apply for adjustments to certain parking standards. And those of you on the commission who have been here for a little while, I'm sure noticed that increase in requests for adjustments for parking standards and loading standards and so forth. So with that trend and those challenges, staff realized that what we need is really to overhaul the regulations in this area. And with that, and with the City Council's direction, we decided to go ahead and comprehensively update the specific plan. So in 2014, the city entered into a contract with MIG Inc. And MIG started its work by doing extensive research on the area, determining the existing conditions in Smoky Hollow, and really leading a really robust and extensive public outreach effort. And all that led to the development of the specific plan document and the EIR that you have before you tonight.
And Paul, I'm sorry,
yes.
Wasn't there also a ULI study in Smoky Hollow that helped
Yes,
influence this?
prior to that, there was a ULI study, you're right. And one of the recommendations of that study was to pursue a comprehensive update of the Smoky Hollow specific
And that's the
plan.
Urban Land Institute. That's a national group that had, was very optimistic about the region. Is that right?
That's correct. With that, I will introduce our lead consultant, Genevieve Shero, with MIG is the project lead on behalf of MIG Inc. She's been with this project from the beginning, and she will go over that initial research and public participation process that led us all the way to today.
Good evening, Chairman and Commissioners. So looking back to 2015 when we started the process, we started with kind of 5 major goals in mind: building from the ULI study, direction from staff, and just kind of our gut feelings about the district. To really build a vision based on community input for this district, for the dynamic district that it is and it can be. To secondarily to revisit the allowed uses and the businesses, recognizing some of the issues that had been coming up with specific uses that wanted to site here and weren't able to, making buildings work correctly, and really what types of buildings and uses fit within that vision that we're to develop. Thirdly, to study and revise those building design guidelines and standards to make those uses and businesses happen. And to develop parking solutions was a critical component of the task to address some of the existing parking problems that are there and to develop long-term parking solutions. And then finally, to identify opportunities for mobility enhancement and placemaking strategies to really enhance the district and let it be to the best of its ability. So the first effort that we started with is the existing conditions analysis. And to do that, we started talking with stakeholders right up front and got great feedback from property owners, planning commissioners, Chevron, different stakeholders about what their primary concerns were for the district and what they saw as the best potential for the district. We took that information along with some baseline reports that we prepared on the employment and market conditions, land use, how the buildings were relating to the street, urban design, traffic analysis, all of the baseline understanding to move forward from a knowledge and data-driven position. And we took that information towards a community workshop where the community was able to look at different types of land uses and identify what they would like to see and really move us towards that community vision. We heard a lot from the community about existing concerns about parking and the need to address that readily. But there was also a kind of ongoing discussion that pointed out that parking shouldn't be the only thing that we're addressing here. We need to address the existing parking issues, but we need to recognize that this is a long-term plan and our parking needs might change. What we really want is a dynamic district that is a success for residents, businesses, and as a creative hub for the region, really. So we took that input and we went back to develop that vision and to identify some alternatives to bring back to the community. And we went to the community with a concept alternative summary. And we were able, through polling exercise with clickers, to identify what folks in the audience preferred from a variety of different options. So we looked at all of the roadways within the district and said, you know, here are some ideas about what we could do with these roadways. What do you think? How would you vote, or how would you poll? How would you like to see this happen? We were able to live see what folks liked better than others. On Franklin, for instance, we had resounding support for kind of an inclusive street that really becomes the backbone for the district, that is dynamic and equal priority for pedestrians, cyclists, and automobiles. So we took the information from the alternatives workshop and were able to move forward with drafting the specific plan. We had a pretty clear vision from the community of what needed to be addressed, what needed to be done. We wrote the specific plan and completed an environmental impact report, and moved these documents towards a community open house back in April, where we had probably well over 100 folks who attended. Well, over 100 folks attended actually the first community workshop as well. We had really great turnout, so feel really good about just how involved everyone was in the process. And at the workshop, at the open house, we heard so much great support for the project, a lot of, really high excitement about the project and the ideas in the plan. So with that, we were able to talk through all of the plan with a lot of folks, answer a lot of questions, and take some recommendations to tweak the plan to make it clearer, to make it meet needs more in a specific way. We made some edits to the plan and are bringing that plan forward tonight for your consideration. So what is that plan? That plan has 5 parts. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the vision. Paul's going to go through the last 4 chapters. We've broken it down in kind of a different way than you might see some other specific plans. The second chapter is on the private realm, and what we mean there is everything on private property. So that's where your building standards are and the uses, so that if somebody's just interested in that piece, they can go just to that piece. The public realm, this is where we talk about the mobility improvements, how we really envision the placemaking strategies that are in the public realm. Chapter 4 is administration, largely pertaining to some of the kind of zoning particulars that are in Chapter 2 and how those processes work. And then Chapter 5 looks at implementation. What are the actions to get us towards that vision that this specific plan identifies? And that vision is for Smoky Hollow to be an eclectic incubator district of creative, innovative, and dynamic businesses. And to that goal, there are 8 guiding principles that kind of frame the specific plan in general. The first is to promote a vibrant Smoky Hollow as an incubator hub and creative center that attracts and retains and grows local businesses that are creative and cutting edge. The second is to support infrastructure improvements that also move towards that goal of attracting and retaining businesses. These are infrastructure of the roadways, telecommunications, a variety of different infrastructure. The third is to preserve Smoky Hollow's mid-century industrial feel. The identity within the district is highly valued, and the intimate nature and the history and the authenticity is really critical to the image and character of the district. Fourth, to develop parking solutions. Parking remains a primary concern in the district for local businesses and nearby residents, so the plan identifies short-term and long-term solutions to that issue. That the specific plan provides for commercial and industrial uses that promote new and existing businesses and sustain economic growth and incorporate sustainability principles. Sixth, an attractive and distinctive image is one of the reasons that Smoky Hollow really is so special. It's the walkable and cohesive built environment that's enduring, that builds that image and really sells that image to local businesses and throughout the region of really creating a sense of place and is a critical piece of the local identity. Seventh, as a center for activity, the specific plan prioritizes walking and bicycling pathways to Main Street, to PCH, and throughout the district as kind of a critical piece of moving folks throughout the district and making it a district that is cohesive. And then finally, emphasizing flexibility, creativity, and innovation. Smoky Hollow is drawing creative businesses, innovative thinking, and really great ideas. And so the specific plan really looks to be flexible to those changes and knowing that change comes over time to adapt to those. So it builds in flexibility through administrative adjustments and opportunities that we might not anticipate to try and recognize just how much it can change over time. So Paul's going to talk more about the private realm now.
Okay, so going on to the private realm and the administration chapter, we're going to discuss that at the same time together because they are tied together. And hey, can I have that remote? Yeah. Great. So jumping right in, I just wanted to point out sort of the zoning in the area. It follows the same kind of zoning as currently in the specific plan. In other words, the two main districts have the same boundaries. Here are the two districts on the west side, so we've creatively named these districts Smoky Hollow West and Smoky Hollow East, dividing line being the alley between Lomita and Maryland Street. And so moving on, regarding the permitted uses in these districts. So just want to try to hit the highlights of all these different standards and sections. Industrial uses are permitted, will still be permitted in this new specific plan with the exception of maybe uses such as freight forwarding where there does not seem to be a demand anymore for that type of use, so that's no longer going to be permitted there. General offices will be permitted without the previous restrictions that I mentioned earlier to allow that transition to occur. Studios, film, photo studios will be permitted. Those were limited to only accessory uses under the existing plan. Some uses will be permitted with a discretionary permit, such as restaurants and assembly halls, to help sort of control for potential impacts such as parking or traffic or noise. So we will look at those cases individually depending on the location. Parking facilities will be permitted by right in the P zone in the center of the district. However, they will be permitted elsewhere in the district with approval of an administrative use permit.
I have a question, if you don't mind. Right after the public facilities, on the list, there's residential. And I know that we've got caretaker unit, and that's been defined, and that has not been developed. Prohibited uses are live work. And can you discuss that or share with me what the thoughts are on that and why we've not taken that aspect, added it to this beautiful specific plan that you guys have developed?
Yeah, that was based a lot on the public input that we received. As we went through the process, we did not hear a lot about residential uses, and the priority and the focus was really towards encouraging that trend, that transition from the traditional sort of manufacturing uses to more creative types of uses in the district.
It was included, some of the questions, and there were 3 questions that pertained to residential living beyond the 500 square foot caretaker unit. And is this the type of thing that could be developed? Can we talk about that further?
Of course, yes.
Adding to the specific plan as we move forward?
Yeah, this is the place to do that, yes. If
Okay.
it is the commission's thinking that
Okay.
this is something that should be added, then we will definitely go into that and
Okay.
look into that, yeah.
So I have some questions about caretaker as well, caretaker units. Are you going to get into that in a future page?
No, we did not go into caretaker units in our presentation, so please go ahead.
So you now have 126 dwelling units that are assigned to caretaker in the new plan, is that right? Is that on,
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
so the new plan, there's designated for 126 dwelling units for caretaker.
I think that's the estimate of what we might expect realistically.
And that was based
Is that
on,
It's only 6. We only anticipate maybe another 6 caretaker units in the district.
and how do you determine what is eligible for a caretaker unit?
A caretaker unit can go onto any property, really. So any property owner can add a caretaker unit to their property or building, and it is supposed to be sort of accessory to the primary use. Somebody who's there to take care of the property when the business is closed. That's essentially the purpose of that, and that has been its purpose since the specific plan was adopted originally. Yeah.
And why only 6?
There are no limits placed on the development of caretaker units, but that is what we estimated may occur during the lifetime of the plan, based on the previous development trends and the demand for that particular.
And then what's the difference between that and live work?
There's not a huge difference, although when it comes to live work, it's a little bit more of a complete unit, whereas the caretaker unit is rather limited in nature.
But we're saying that live work is not an acceptable use. So in other words, somebody couldn't actually buy the building, have their business downstairs, live upstairs, unless they were considered a caretaker of the unit, of the building, and it did not exceed 500 square feet.
That's right, yes. And the caretaker need not be the property owner.
Doesn't
or
need to be the
business
property owner.
Yeah.
It could be a complete tenant. Caretaker could be a very broad term.
Or a security guard, for instance.
Sure.
Or so a photographer who wants a studio, they've got 5,000 feet of studio, but they designate, and they have a kitchen in the studio because it's for clients, but then they set aside 500 feet for living, and they're sort of taking care of the place at night. Would that apply?
Yes, you could basically you could essentially accomplish your goal of working there and living there, although that unit, that residential part, would be sort of more restricted, more of an accessory part.
Thank you.
I would really like to see more discussion about that, adding that into the specific plan moving forward, because I think that's going to be an important component for the success of Smoky Hollow.
Or at least have a conversation as
Yeah.
why live work like we have on the downtown specific plan wouldn't work or is not suitable for Smoky Hollow, especially when I think about Franklin. The north side of Franklin is already residential. I know the retail may not be ideally suited for Smoky Hollow, but I could see a loft, creative office / loft thing going in. So if there's reasons this wasn't explored, let us know. But
I think that the idea of expanding the residential uses in downtown came about when this decision had already been made in the process of Smoky Hollow. And that's probably the only reason why this wasn't considered at the time. I will say, though, that our housing element is going to be due in 3 years, and we're going to start the process next year. And that might be the appropriate time to look at this question and maybe modify Smoky Hollow if it seems like the right approach.
we could do it now too, right? I mean, we're
Oh,
talking
yeah, no,
about the
I'm only
plan.
making a suggestion, and
Okay.
absolutely, you can expand this at this time.
Yeah, I would think that might be a wise decision, that 500 square feet is about a small one-bedroom apartment. So I don't think we're going to have a lot of children living in there. We have to look at our school usage or recreation.
but with the kinds of businesses that are going in, they're so creative and innovative, it might be really something to be considered, and we should probably have something in writing controlling what these living units look like.
Yeah, I understand. Actually, the only reason that I'm suggesting that we look at that as a follow-up is that it may have implications for the CEQA process, and we may push this process out another couple months, and I don't know at this time without doing the analysis.
On the housing note, and you can tell me to shelve my question until later, as I'm a little new at this, but there are about 6 acres, if I calculated it correctly, that used to have a housing overlay on them that no longer, it doesn't look like they do any longer. It's on the northwest corner of Grand and Kansas. And I feel like that segues into this conversation about housing, and I know it's been a popular topic in the community, and to eliminate that much acreage of potential housing, even though there are businesses there that I don't think have any intention of, in the immediate future, becoming any sort of multifamily or for sale residential housing. It might be an appropriate time to look at it with the housing element or combine it with this conversation about live work.
Yeah, with that particular location, we did not hear from the community as we went through this process that there was a demand for housing, but specifically with that location, I think based on the prior uses there, from let's say an environmental point of view, it might be very difficult to get housing development there, residential development at that particular location. The types of uses that operated there, and then potentially contamination on the property. Yeah, but it's definitely something we can investigate. But from what I understand, those are some of the reasons why that particular property did not retain that overlay.
I think it's currently auto repair and then the old International Rectifier properties.
Yeah. Okay. May I?
Yeah, continue, please.
Terrific. So moving on to the development standards after the permitted uses on the FAR, there is a slight increase to the FAR allowance on the west side from 0.6 to 0.75, and slightly more on the east side of Smoky Hollow to 1.0. With a community benefits plan approval, that FAR could exceed those limits and go up to 1.5 with Planning Commission approval, or requests for even higher FAR could be approved through a community benefits plan if the city council approves it. We will go over community benefits plans in a little bit more detail a little bit later on. One thing I wanted to point out, that there is an FAR limit in the parking zone. I wanted to kind of explain why. Because we anticipate that in the parking zone, when we have structures built, there will potentially be some ground floor areas where there are uses built. And the intention behind that is to have sort of storefronts or businesses without disruption, without an interruption along Franklin Avenue especially. So moving on from the FAR standards, going on to building height. So on building height, there is not a change in the base limit for building height. It would remain at 35 feet and allow for exceptions such as parapets and accessory structures or equipment on top of the roof. Although with approval of a community benefits plan, the building height could increase up to 50 feet. And allowing a height above 35 feet would actually enable some of those properties to take advantage of the additional FAR allowance that has been added under the FAR limits. With regard to setbacks, there are some changes there. Main changes in the front yard facing streets. We've reduced the setback from a range of 4 to 10 feet today to 0. And again, the primary purpose there is to connect the private property with the public property, and to make the district more walkable. Having those businesses front directly on the street will allow that to happen. And another change is an increase to the setback required along alleys from 5 feet to 10 feet. We anticipate this 10-foot building setback area to be a flexible space where it can be used for loading purposes, for instance, or it could be a break area or a seating area or a deck for employees or tenants and so forth. And we did that because we anticipate alleys to be further improved and to be activated, particularly at those intersections with Franklin Avenue. There's opportunities there. With regard to open space, not a significant change to the amount of open space required. It is 3% today on the west side of Smoky Hollow. Today it is 7% on the east side, and we're proposing 3% for the smaller lots and 10% for the larger parcels. One change to the, let's say, calculation of open space is that we would be accepting rooftop gardens as meeting the requirement for open space, although we would still require a minimum of 50% of the open space to be accessible from the ground level. Another change was the introduction of requiring shade trees in surface parking lots in order to kind of improve the visual aesthetics, but also the obvious environmental benefits from having trees in the area. With regard to vehicle access, we're proposing to not allow new curb cuts along street frontages in the two main districts, and to require existing curb cuts to be removed when we have new development, new buildings going up, or substantial additions to buildings.
What's the purpose of that?
The idea, again, is to reduce or eliminate those interruptions in the continuity of the sidewalk, improve walkability, and sort of
turn them into parking spots too, probably.
And yes, to increase the opportunities for on-site parking, on-street parking, yes. With regard to loading, we are proposing some substantial changes from the current requirements. Today, we require a relatively large loading space for nearly every building, no matter what the use. And the loading space, the minimum size is 12 feet by 25 feet. And we're proposing to not require loading spaces for smaller buildings, only for larger buildings and restaurants, which may have a higher use or need for the loading requirements. So that raises the question, where will loading occur for those small buildings? Well, we believe that loading and deliveries have kind of changed in nature over time and recently. That's related to so the types of uses that we anticipate to have here in Smoky Hollow. And deliveries typically take place on a small truck, like a UPS truck, that generally fits into a regular parking space for the most part. And the deliveries take only a few minutes to complete. So we believe that there is no need anymore to have a dedicated 24 hours a day loading space for a small business or an office type of use or a small building. But where will it take place if in case they need it, or in those times that it does happen? That 10-foot setback that I mentioned earlier along alleys would be a place where somebody could do loading and unloading. And again, that will be a flexible space. Typically loading takes only a few minutes, so we didn't want to require something on the property full time. And the commission know that we've received a lot of requests for adjustments from the loading requirements. In fact, starting in 2010, since 2010, we received 20 requests for adjustments to parking and loading standards only in Smoky Hollow. So that kind of told us that we need to do something different here. And there's also
Paul, can you go just to the page before real quick?
Mm-hmm.
There were parking requirements, parking lots.
Parking lot landscaping or shade trees in parking lots. We will go into
parking. Do you
soon.
address tandem parking in this?
Yes.
In development standards?
Tandem parking is allowed, only 2 spaces deep. And we'll go over some of the parking requirements with regard to the numbers in a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. Another place where loading might occur is if there is a need, if we identify that, when we go through and make street improvements to add parking to those side streets, we may, if there's a need, maybe on a block per block basis, dedicate a loading space on the street, perhaps time limited, so it's used certain times of the day, and then it can revert back to parking for the rest of the day. And we'll evaluate that as it comes, as the need arises. So with regard to parking, we are proposing a significant change to what our standard parking requirements are. Today, we typically require parking based on the type of use, so the rate changes depending on the type of use. We are proposing a single rate irrespective of the type of use throughout the district, a rate of 400 square feet, one space for every 400 square feet of gross floor area. That will allow future businesses to easily transition from one business to the other without having to provide additional parking, which is a very big challenge for businesses today. With that said, those businesses or buildings that are non-conforming today or will be after, hopefully, this plan is approved, when they change occupancy, so that first time that they change use occupancy, they will be required to comply with this parking rate. But thereafter, they can go back and forth from office to industrial to, some sort of retail activity and so forth.
And Paul, how will the city know if a tenant has changed in the building? By a business permit?
Well, when they decide to change the occupancy of the use, they typically have to do some improvements and they have to submit plans with the city. So at that time, we would.
Occupancy is a building issue, more so than a zoning use.
Mm-hmm.
So just changing a business is not necessarily going to trigger the occupancy change. But if there's construction of an interior improvement, that may be indication of an occupancy change. And so when the certificate of occupancy has a different label on it than the previous one, then that's what the trigger will be.
Okay, so it'd have to come through the building department as tenant improvements, and that'll trigger, okay, now we gotta look at your parking.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And there will be options, and we are building options such as the parking in lieu fee that we discussed and is another item on your agenda tonight to assist those businesses that are making that initial change, if they do, to meet their requirements. We've also built in bicycle parking requirements to be consistent with California Green Building Code requirements. And I just want to go over a little bit more about the reason behind requiring a single parking rate rather than doing it by use. So currently, as I said, we base our parking rates on use. And those rates are based on what we call the net floor area of the building. And just as a couple of examples, warehouses need parking at a rate of 1 space per 1,000, industrial uses 1 per 500, offices 1 per 300, and so forth. And that is based on the net floor area. What we propose is a single rate and that is based on the gross floor area. And I just want to go over the differences there. So gross floor area is the entire area of a building within its perimeter walls. Net floor area is a smaller area. So you take the gross floor area and you exclude areas such as elevator shafts, mechanical or electrical equipment rooms, common restrooms, and so forth. So the lower the net floor area, the lower your parking requirement. So what we have seen as staff and what you have seen as a commission is a lot of property owners, designers, and architects trying desperately to fit as much building as they can on their property and keep the parking rate or the number of parking spaces required as low as possible. So they do that in two ways primarily. They either disguise what the use of the building is going to be, or they disguise the size of the building. So that's why you have seen some floor plans, for instance, that show a rather small room that looks like an office-sized room, but labeled warehousing. That room might be on the second floor of a building without any access, reasonable access to do any loading and unloading. Or you might see some electrical equipment rooms that are curiously large. They don't really, they're not
Corner
tied
office.
to the actual need for that kind of equipment. So for those reasons, we propose to have a single rate based on the gross floor area. It is sort of a common basis, and we'll kind of do away with a lot of those sort of attempts to, disguise sizes and uses.
And how'd you come up with 400?
Well, we looked at some of the floor plans of buildings, and we saw what the parking requirements were. When you had an office with a little bit of warehouse somewhere in the building and restrooms, and that tended to average out really to about a 1 per 400 rate. That's mainly the reason.
Paul, just for my own edification, let's say there was a restaurant and the net versus the gross, something hypothetical in my brain, the electrical room would not count under net. Would the elevator, you said, wouldn't?
No.
What if there's storage that wouldn't?
It would count at a lower rate.
At a lower rate. If there was the common restrooms, you say that is not.
That would not count.
That would not count. What would count in a restaurant? Just the area that you're serving a client?
It would be the dining area and what we would call sort of the back of house, kitchen, prep, and those things. Yeah.
Okay. That would be probably the most extreme example of what you propose at 400 square feet versus 75 square feet would be a restaurant. That would be the most extreme example.
Yeah.
You figure that in your brain that it seems to work out okay, comparatively?
That is part of the reason why we recommended under the permitted uses to require a discretionary permit for restaurants, specifically to make sure that on a case-by-case basis there aren't any unanticipated sort of parking or traffic type of impacts to that area.
So the proposed 400 square feet gross floor area is case-by-case basis?
Just for
On
restaurants.
specific uses.
Just
on
for restaurants,
Mhm.
okay.
A restaurant would have to come and ask for permission and show us how it's going to work, where they're going to park.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
So moving on from this to, and that kind of completes the development standards part of this. Sure.
I do have one question, Paul. Remind us again how you calculate FAR, floor area ratio.
Today we calculated based on the net floor area of a building and the net area of the property or the lot.
So a 1 point FAR is basically a 0 lot line. So how do you get to 1.5?
You could go higher.
Just
yes.
going higher. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Thank you.
So the plan also contains design guidelines, and I'll go over those briefly. Their purpose in general is to enhance the existing character of buildings and facilitate gatherings, so providing outdoor gathering spaces, utilizing the existing building but adding elements, such as around the windows, for instance, over here, or along the facade, to kind of enhance the character of those buildings. Also, to preserve the industrial feel of the district, so for instance, by using metal siding where it's appropriate in combination with other materials and colors. Additions that complement the existing buildings that convey a sense of old and new, and that where they don't try to imitate the existing design or architectural feel of the building, but rather kind of distinguish between the two. Also, enhancing entrances to buildings and encouraging connectivity to the public right-of-way. That way those entrances are easily identifiable and they're easy to get in and out of the private property to the public sidewalk.
So in that example, if you are required to have a 0 setback, that little garden in front would not be allowed?
You're not required to have a 0 setback. You're allowed to have a 0
Thank you.
setback.
Okay.
Yes. And that covered the.
Is there going to be regulation on the width of sidewalks? Because that's a real issue in Smoky Hollow right now.
Okay.
Unless you're going to cover that later, we don't need to.
Well, there are some minimum standards that have to do with ADA accessibility, for instance, so 4 feet or so. There are some areas where we will be proposing to expand sidewalks in the district. Not everywhere, but in some areas. So when we go over the public realm, we can go over some of those areas where
thank
we
you.
will be proposing to expand
Thank you.
sidewalks. So going over the exceptions and community benefits plans. So today the municipal code allows for administrative adjustments. Whenever someone wants to apply for a deviation from a particular development standard, if that is a small change, the director is allowed at the administrative level to review and approve those requests. And we are carrying that same concept into the specific plan. So if there's requests to deviate from a numeric development standard by up to 10% from the standard, then that would be something that the director would be able to review and approve with an administrative adjustment. Any requests above that limit would require approval of a community benefits plan. The community benefits plan level has been separated into 2 tiers, review by the Planning Commission and review by the City Council. So requests for exceptions from building height requirements up to 50 feet would be reviewed by the Planning Commission. Requests for FAR up to 1.5, again, would be reviewed by the Planning Commission. And any other deviations above 10%, as I mentioned earlier, that above the director level would be reviewed by the Planning Commission. FAR requests above 1.5 would be reviewed by the City Council, and requests for multiple deviations, including height or FAR, would be reviewed by the City Council. There are findings built into the specific plan to sort of guide the decision makers or what to weigh when they're making those decisions, and those are primarily potential impacts from the deviation in that standard, and then also the how the proposed benefit to the community helps to meet the goals of the specific plan, particularly those goals for the public improvements. And speaking of that, we'll go over a few examples of community benefits.
Well, let me ask first.
Sure.
The larger changes, are you saying that goes directly to City Council and it bypasses the Planning Commission, or it comes here and then has to go to City Council?
The Planning Commission would have an advisory role.
Okay, good.
Also, Paul, can you just explain, if you haven't already, the design guidelines and when those are triggered?
Yeah, so the design guidelines are triggered whenever there's sort of a discretionary request. So on the rather small projects that are developed by right, improvements to buildings, TIs, or small additions, where there's no additional environmental review or there's no requests for exceptions, those are voluntary guidelines that we as staff during the permit review process, at the building permit review process, would encourage applicants to abide by those guidelines as much as possible. But we didn't want the guidelines to be sort of to deter people from making improvements to their properties, particularly those smaller properties on those smaller projects. But on the larger projects where we have an initial study or a mitigated negative declaration where we impose conditions of approval, at that point during that review process, we could and we would insert conditions and requiring compliance with those design guidelines.
And then, Paul, is there some sort of a trigger for traffic study? Is there something where a larger project exceeds a certain permitted standard that would trigger that?
Yes.
That's going to be coming to you next month. There will be a site plan review process that will apply citywide, but also to Smoky Hollow. We're just working on what the thresholds will be to trigger that right now, and that will be here. And it'll probably be adopted around the same time the Smoky Hollow gets adopted.
Thank you.
Okay, and then during the community benefits plan process, that is also an occasion where the decision maker, planning commission or city council, would weigh, compliance with those design standards versus the request for an exception. Okay, these are some of the examples of community benefits: publicly accessible open space on somebody's property, or additional parking that's available to the public on somebody's property above their requirement, in other words. Potential funding for streetscape improvements. And that's sort of a good transition to lead us into the public realm discussion here. So where this is sort of a short list of areas where the plan aims to make physical improvements, to the public property, public right-of-way. And I'll try to go through these quickly. Along El Segundo, the Boulevard, the intent is to try to narrow down slightly the existing travel lanes to add a parking lane on the north side of the street. And the other item on your agenda tonight, the Parking in Lieu fee program, is a potential funding source for these improvements along El Segundo Boulevard. On Grand Avenue, yes.
Before you get off El Segundo Boulevard, that particular configuration is, it's in existing 4 lanes. Where you're gonna put parking now is sort of there's some funky lines painted on the street. Makes perfect sense to park there. I regularly see people drive on El Segundo Boulevard at 50 miles an hour. I mean, in fact, it's even cited in this plan as a minor thoroughfare. And I'm not sure what the designation between major and minor is, but Grand Avenue is designated as a minor thoroughfare. El Segundo Boulevard is a minor thoroughfare. They seem to be way different in just kind of speed. And so I'm wondering, did you guys ever consider going down to 3 lanes here with a center turn lane? And with the idea, if Smoky Hollow is intended to be this place that is multimodal, pedestrian, get people to slow down. That's a dangerous word here in El Segundo, slow down traffic. But really, it's about economic development. How did you get to 4 lanes here versus maybe instead of reducing the lane width, people are still going to go 50 miles an hour there?
Well, reducing the lane width does have a slight impact on travel speeds, so that does help slightly address that particular issue. The 3-lane configuration was considered, and we had a few concerns from the public, some of the users in the area, Chevron, and the truck traffic in and out along El Segundo. So that's primarily why we ended up with a smaller sort of intervention along El Segundo Boulevard.
Okay, so big trucks pulling out of Chevron means you can't pass them if you've only got 1 travel lane. Gotcha.
I will also add that we did have early discussions with the police and fire department, and both requested that we not go to 3 lanes because they use it as their fastest connection to the east side.
Everybody does.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's why they go 50 miles an hour there.
Yeah, it's going to be, when you add the planners and landscaping, that's all really nice, but pulling out onto El Segundo Boulevard it's a risky move, especially from those alleys where you've got limited visibility. But challenges I'm sure we can face when we get there. But I also think El Segundo Boulevard is one of the designated trucking routes in the city.
Right. It ain't no minor thoroughfare, that's for sure.
That's true.
Yep.
Okay. So moving from El Segundo Boulevard to Grand Avenue, the intent there is to make some bicycle-related improvements to put in to make these shared lanes, the curb lanes, so that they're shared with between bicycles and automobiles. The one intervention there, in addition to the stenciling, those Shero markings, would be to slightly widen that curb lane to 13 feet. And that would allow for parking during non-peak times. That's about 8 feet of a parking lane, and then an extra 5 feet that would allow cyclists to ride past those parked cars without, affecting the other travel lane. And then during peak times.
Well, is that Shero then accurately drawn, or will be more off to the
this
side?
Yeah.
It kind of looks like it's in the middle of the road there.
Well,
Is
the
the
Sharrow-
concept that it'll be like another lane next to?
No, it wouldn't be a separate lane. Sharrow simply designates that this lane is supposed to be shared between cyclists and automobile drivers.
Okay.
And practically speaking, when there's parked cars, the cyclists will go around on the left side of the parked cars. But then when there's no parking allowed during the peak hours, cyclists will naturally tend to go towards the curb, and then those cars will still be able to go around cyclists and stay within their lane.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually safer to ride a bike with the cars parked there because the cars on the inside lane aren't trying to get into that lane. You know, they give you an automatic buffer.
Uh-huh. On Franklin Avenue, Genevieve alluded to this earlier. The long-term vision is to make this an inclusive street, very active, very vibrant. In the shorter term, the immediate improvements that we envision are to provide some decorative crosswalks at each intersection, to provide curb extensions at intersections. That way you're shortening the distance from one side of the street to the other, which improves walkability on Franklin. To add landscaping whenever there is an opportunity. And I will mention also parklets. We hope to be able to build in some parklets, starting with a pilot project perhaps to test it, to see how successful it is, evaluate it, and then if it's successful to kind of spread it in the district.
So Paul, I love parklets. I think they're great. I think they're a great way to add vibrancy to the street. How do you reconcile where to put parklets when you're trying to solve parking issues? Because a parklet typically takes up a parking space. Is that right?
So that is something that we'll have to weigh at the time when we're deciding whether to pursue parklets, maybe perhaps on a larger scale. Our plan calls for starting out with a pilot project. See if it works, see if it's successful, if it's received well by the businesses, the tenants, and so forth. And then we will weigh that against the need for parking. And typically, if you take into account the improvements that we're proposing to add parking in the district, which will be approximately 160 parking spaces district-wide on other streets. If we provide a few parklets and lose a few spaces on Franklin, the net difference will not be substantial. So we will test it out and see how that goes. And speaking of adding parking, the plan calls for reconfiguring those north-south traveling streets from two-way to one-way traffic, and adding angled parking on one side of the street. That will potentially increase the parking on those streets by about 25% compared to the existing parking supply. And then this will also add, there will also be opportunities to add landscaping in certain areas along those streets as part of these improvements. The parking in lieu fee program that is proposed and on your agenda tonight is a potential funding source for these improvements.
So on your one-way street plan, which I like as well, typically in an urban environment, you've got one-way streets that alternate. And you kind of expect that if you can't turn left here, you can do it on the next block. I notice a couple of streets on this plan, you double up. There's two one-way onlys that are going north.
Yes.
Why don't they alternate in a more logical, well, and predictable manner, I guess?
Yeah, the reason for that was primarily the number of additional parking spaces that could be provided depending on the direction, and that was kind of a function of how many curb cuts there are on each block. So depending on how many curb cuts were on each side of the street, it made more sense to change the direction one way and one going north versus south, and you get more parking spaces that way. Our traffic engineers that evaluated the plan said that it's although it's not the typical one street this way, the other street that way, alternating one at a time, it's still acceptable. People tend to get used to it over time, and it doesn't have a sort of an impact on flow or anything.
Are you going to talk about how streets are chosen to be one way, as the plan moves forwards when you talk about the parking in lieu fees? Then I can save this question for then if you prefer.
Yeah, that's kind of related to the parking in lieu fee item.
Oh, wait.
Okay.
Sure.
Great, so I'll move on from the north-south streets. Along alleys, as I mentioned, there is potential for improvement along alleys. If you combine, efforts and regulations on the private property and our goals for the alleys, public improvements along alleys, we hope to activate these spaces. We believe that there's opportunities, especially near those intersections. Parklets, as I mentioned, we hope to at least do a pilot project. This is I'm giving you an idea of what they would look like. They're basically an extension of the existing curb line, if you can see that existing curb line there. And this area was added to provide additional seating. And that seating, can be just casual seating, or it could be benches. I see in other similar parklets, bike racks, and they can have different amenities for the businesses, the users.
Did you guys study lighting as part of this? When you went to the alley slide, I thought, is that alley lit at night?
Yeah, we didn't do a study on lighting specifically.
Right, but it'll be an important part of the whole vibrancy of the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So moving from the private realm, development standards and design guidelines to implementation. The implementation chapter contains an action plan and a funding strategy. There are 30 specific actions in the implementation, giving you a few of the examples here real quickly. Early in the priorities is to do a detailed engineering study. So basically take those high priority major infrastructure projects and study the costs, identify the potential funding sources, and then move on to integrate them into the city's capital improvements program, because that's defined every year. Parklet pilot project is one of those action plans to help meet some of the plan's goals. Establishing a parking in lieu fee program is another planned action, implementation action. And something related to accessibility and parking solutions is to potentially expand that lunchtime shuttle service that we have today to run through Smoky Hollow, run all day long, perhaps. That could potentially take people from the east side of town and those Green Line stations down to Smoky Hollow into downtown, and providing additional ways for people to get around in town or come to town for their work.
Does the city keep ridership numbers on the lunchtime shuttle?
I am not sure if that's the case.
I'd be curious to know if that's being used today before we talk about expanding it, because I saw the shuttle when I was having lunch today and it was empty, but I saw 3 or 4 bird scooters zipping around town. So
yeah, well, one of the things is that regularity of service has a very big impact on ridership.
Right.
So the more infrequently something, a bus or something comes through, the less people tend to use it. So
yeah, right now I believe the intent is to pull people from east of PCH to downtown during lunch.
Lunch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Paul, this is just number 8 in our notes is actually the crosswalk enhancement pilot project.
Oh, I think that was a typo. So
okay.
Yeah.
So is it the parklet, which is number 9, or is it the actual crosswalk that you want to implement first?
I was just giving you a few examples of action plans. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah. So I just typed in the wrong number, I think.
No, that's fine.
So
these are some examples of implementation.
Under the topic of
actions.
funding, the decorative crosswalks, the parklets, the public realm items. I'm thinking about, how's this stuff going to get paid for? Has there been a discussion with new development, like a % for art or something like that, that could be applied to some of these public realm things as new development comes in? Those are very popular in other cities.
Yeah, there have been some discussions about that, very preliminary at this point. And a lot of the items that could be done, like on Franklin Avenue, would be nominal additional cost whenever they resurface it, whenever that comes up. So a lot of the improvements will actually be very low cost.
Okay, speaking of funding, as I mentioned, the second part of the implementation chapter identifies some potential funding sources. So there's 3 different categories, sort of broad categories. There's city resources, such as the general fund, the capital improvements plan, which also draws funds from state sources, grants, whether they be state or federal grants, user fees, such as parking permits, for instance, for street parking or structure parking or metered parking that could help fight funding. Developer contributions, such as when projects come through the process and there are impacts, such as the traffic, and there's mitigation measures required, those developers would contribute or potentially make physical improvements to mitigate those impacts. Parking in lieu fees, again, would be one potential funding source for some of those improvements. The community benefit plans, we believe will contribute significantly to this. And other agreements, such as individual development agreements on a project-by-project basis.
Just to go back for a sec, on the impact mitigation, are we talking about developer impact fees, similar to on the residential side, you pay school fees, park fees, something based on a square footage basis?
It's along those lines. The city has established mitigation fees, which developers would pay as a matter of course. However, on an individual project basis, if there's a large project that where we do a traffic study and we identify that specific project generates so much traffic that it has a significant impact, if the study identifies physical ways or improvements to mitigate those impacts, they would be required to mitigate those impacts to, for instance, make changes to traffic signals, for instance, or things of that sort. And then moving on to the last category of funding sources, district-based resources, where the district is contributing, essentially the property owners. So there's 3 general ways to engage the property owners through special assessment districts, such as a business improvement district or a landscaping and lighting district, where there's this additional assessment on the property tax bill that goes towards funding generally speaking, smaller improvements and then operations and maintenance of facilities. Community facilities districts are similar in nature in that there would be additional property tax assessment. Although under these types of districts, there is an ability to use the increased tax revenues to support issuance of bonds to make major improvements. In both of these cases, in order to create the district, there would need to be a vote by the property owners. Another sort of district-wide resource would be an enhanced infrastructure financing district. In this particular case, it's not an additional assessment on a property tax, although the district would essentially reserve future growth in property tax revenue for the purpose of making improvements in that district. And in this case, there is no vote required to create the district. However, if there is a bond issuance, then the property owners would vote on that. So those are some of the ways to finance this plan. It involves the city resources, developers, property owners, and that means that when it comes to the implementation, we will have to sort of coordinate with all the stakeholders involved, property owners and the city and the developers together to try to achieve the goals, make the improvements that we're envisioning.
Well, besides parking in lieu program, are there any concrete examples of how we're going to actually fund these improvements?
Well,
I get the examples you gave us, but those aren't before us today, right?
those specific examples are not before us. These are goals, and these are sort of ideas that we can implement. So that would be the next step in the process. With the parking in lieu fee program, we're essentially kind of jumping ahead, trying to start that implementation process, trying to identify a funding source and to sort of go after it.
Okay.
And speaking of implementation and action plans, the number one on that list is to adopt a general plan amendment so that the general plan is consistent with the proposed specific plan. And that takes us to the required entitlements for this project. So I'll just go over that briefly. The general plan amendment before you is to make changes to the general plan land use map to kind of reflect the creation of the new plan and its new boundaries, and also to reflect that some properties were removed from the previous plan and they will be redesignated, and also to make some language changes in the land use element of the general plan. The zone change, again, is to reflect the change zoning for the properties that will go in the plan, and then to reflect that change in zoning to the property that was developed with residential development, that will sort of change to an R3 designation, multifamily residential. And there's also a zone text amendment before you to make changes to the municipal code that and delete or revise provisions that deal with the existing Smoky Hollow specific plan that will no longer be applicable. That's in summary what the entitlements are before you, along with the environmental assessment. For the environmental assessment, I'll hand things over back to Genevieve to go over that for you.
Thanks. So it might seem kind of weird that we're doing an environmental impact report or a stack of papers, but CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, does require that planning documents that allow a change in development are assessed for their environmental impacts. So we prepared an environmental impact report to describe the potential environmental consequences of development that would happen in the specific plan in the amounts that we think that it would happen. So this is intended to serve as an informational document for decision makers to understand what those potential impacts are. The draft EIR was released back in March for a 45-day comment period. It looked at 17 different areas of impact and identified certain areas as less than significant impacts. Some of them were identified to have significant impacts, but were able to mitigate them through mitigation measures. And there were 3 remaining areas that were identified as significant and unavoidable. Those were pertaining to greenhouse gas emissions associated with traffic or development coming into the district. Noise levels on PCH, given the existing sound levels there, we did a noise study, and the additional traffic associated would increase that already existing noise condition. And the same with traffic on PCH, which the Caltrans has a pretty onerous threshold of additional traffic on already impacted thoroughfares. So those impacts were identified as significant and unavoidable associated with the plan. As the EIR was out for circulation and public comment, we received a number of public comment letters from a variety of different folks that we list here: the Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians, SCAQMD, Dogger, the Department of Conservation, Caltrans, and Sandstone Properties, and a couple other emails from folks in the community that didn't have environmental focus to the questions. So in response to these letters, we will prepare responses to comments. But the Caltrans letter in particular brought up additional requests for additional analysis. So as a result, we prepared an additional additive traffic analysis looking at some of the intersections with the 105 freeway. We looked at 4 freeway ramp intersections at their request, and identified additional impacts at 3 of those intersections through that additional analysis. So because there are additional impacts identified, CEQA requires us to recirculate this information back out to the public for another comment period. So that's what's happening right now. That recirculated EIR is out for public comment for a 45-day comment period, which will close on August 6th. And then once that's closed, we will prepare all of the comments or all of the responses to comments to every comment letter received on the original draft EIR and the recirculated draft EIR, which will be folded together for a final EIR.
And with that, we conclude our presentation. We recommend that the Planning Commission recommend approval of the proposed entitlements and certify the EIR along with the mitigation monitoring plan, findings of fact, and a statement of overriding considerations.
So you're asking us to certify the EIR that's out for public comment right now?
We're asking you to recommend that the City Council certify an EIR based on the draft EIR and the additional analysis that we've conducted.
We don't have comments back from this next circulation.
No, not till August.
If the commission isn't comfortable recommending certification, you can always take public comment, you can discuss it, provide staff direction, we can always bring it back after the comment period closes.
Well, let's ask the question, if this dais is saying, hey, let's consider live-work lofts, does that trigger another environmental impact report? Does that change things? Are we slowing down something that we're at the finish line? How does that affect it?
I would say we definitely need to analyze that. And so we'd have to take another look at the EIR and the impacts.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about some of the thought process behind the vision for the district and the fact that it doesn't include live work. So the caretaker units, in effect, do allow us to have kind of the quintessential live work environment of, you know, you're living in the space that you're working. The concern with allowing, and some of the thought process coming from our economics consultants, the concern for allowing live work in the given market environment where housing is the highest and best use on every property everywhere, is that we don't want to lose the foundational area and have it all turn into residential. There's a lot of existing ability for, especially if you're looking at a live work, kind of a conglomeration of live work units that looks a lot like regular residential, and it doesn't really fit within the intent of the district. So that was one of the reasons that that it moved the way that it did. With regard to the caretaker unit, that is allowed. Some of the existing units today are very live work kind of in their functionality. You know, it could be an architect's studio and a space upstairs. I think within the structure of the EIR that we have already studied, that the caretaker units themselves potentially could be looked at in a little bit of a different way as far as the total area without acting the EIR, I would think. But the intent there is really that it is just a one kind of unit per property in the structure. With regard to the EIR, though, it did not analyze residential in the district, with one exception. The alternatives looks at a few different alternatives. One of the alternatives that was studied was to look at the overlay being retained on the northeast side. So there is a little bit of analysis about some residential in the EIR, but not a lot. So a kind of wholesale looking at a change like that would definitely probably take some additional analysis.
When you say that, does that mean another environmental impact report has to be done?
It would involve a lot of additional analysis. So if we're looking at a change to the types, there's certain ways to do it that have been done to kind of do a trade for residential units versus commercial or industrial space, and to do an environmental analysis in that way. So it might not be an entirely new report, but it would be kind of tearing apart of the existing report and figuring out how to put it back together.
All right. Thank you.
In the same way that Greg had mentioned, looking at the housing overlay as part of an upcoming housing element, could something similar be done for this district, specifically for a live work overlay at that time?
Yeah, specific plans are amendable. So once they're adopted, we can certainly come back and consider amending it to change the uses or change the standards.
And then that then triggers.
And the housing element would probably be a good opportunity to study the demand. And we're going to have to come up with an inventory of sites for the city, and it may be necessary to look at this.
From what I understand, you're talking about that area that was considered for residential and is not now considered residential. It seems it would be prohibitively expensive to build there if there is contamination of the ground.
Yeah, we
And-
thought it was very unlikely to actually be activated for residential, so there wasn't a lot of discussion beyond that. It just doesn't seem like that particular site's going to work, so it was an easy decision to take it out. But when this process started, nobody was even suggesting to us that we should be looking for housing opportunities in Smoky Hollow, so
Yeah.
it wasn't studied.
Right.
I guess I'm not so concerned. It's an interesting point that you bring up about that particular area, but I'm more interested in a live work environment, because I think that just plays right into exactly what we're looking for. Not so much attractive homes or a development of sorts.
I think it's a very intriguing suggestion, and it probably will go a long way to help in the analysis for the housing element, to consider that. I'm not certain. I wasn't here the last time the housing element was done, but I don't think it was even considered then. And so
I actually recall that the housing element looked at a lot of caretaker units in this district. So,
okay,
like 100.
sounds like a little bit of a compromise was considered at the time. So anyway, as I mentioned, that's due by 2021, and so we're starting that process very soon. And these are very valid questions that we'll have to study.
Well, I like the idea that this is amendable, so we can see what needs to be done. We can start here and move on and see just what the needs are. And there may be people who say, I'm not going to live in Smoky Hollow. And there may be people, oh yeah, I want to live, work right where I am. So I think we can be responsive.
So if somebody were wishing to purchase a creative office space and had an existing building but wished to like refurbish the inside of it, and his business was downstairs, whatever it is, and wants to live upstairs, as this new specific plan gets implemented, until it's modified, they actually can't do that if it were beyond 500 square feet. They couldn't actually develop a really nice loft to live in and have their business downstairs, could they?
We'd be limited to 500 square feet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one per building.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you got a condo.
I just feel that this is really, and maybe it's just me, but I just think this is very, I just don't think that's been developed enough. And I know we can do it, and I'm sure it'll be it'll be whatever we all think it needs to be. Whether it happens now or it happens in the near future is fine by me, but I just think it's a really important element for the direction that this is going. You guys have put a lot of work into it. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's just certainly is. Don't mean to throw one more at you, but I think that it's important.
Yeah, I agree. But as I say, I think it's amendable. And there may be units in there right now where people are living, as I was certainly imagine, because everybody's very creative.
Yeah.
So I don't think if somebody already has a building in which they've got a 700-foot apartment, nobody's going to tell them, oh, you can't use those 200 square feet.
No, but they couldn't come to planning and really do something nice to build out.
Well, that it may be that the director could approve something like that without having a CUP. I don't think we need to get hung up on that right
Yeah,
now.
no, let's table
I'm
the
not
live
hung
work
up on it.
idea.
Yeah, I don't
Because
think
I
we
would-
need, I don't think that's the essence of this. I think the essence of what we're considering right now is to devise a plan that is amenable for that area so that we welcome new creative businesses while supporting the ones that are already in place, and we make it more parkable, livable, workable, an enjoyable place that's a credit to El Segundo.
Yeah, I would suggest we open up public comment since we have a lot of folks here, unless there's any more direct questions we want to get from staff. No? All right. So we'll open up public communications. Appreciate everyone being here. Please feel free to step forward. Just tell us your name, where you live, and what your comments are. Oh, come on. Hi, Kim.
Good evening, Honorable Chair and Commission. My name is Kimberly Christensen. I do not live in El Segundo, but I'm here actually representing a major stakeholder and property owner in Smoky Hollow, Sandstone Properties, who did comment on the environmental and on the plan. Excuse me. And they own about 5 acres of land within the plan area on Maryland. And we have been collaborating with and working with city staff and getting feedback on a number of questions and issues and challenges that we're evaluating for possible future plans for the property that Sandstone owns. And staff has been incredibly helpful, and I commend staff and the consultant team on a lot of hard work on getting to this point on the plan. And Sandstone does support the plan. We think that they've addressed a lot of the challenges that private property owners in Smoky Hollow face in trying to redevelop their properties, particularly since many of the properties are developed to standards that were in place before Smoky Hollow specific plan existed that had higher densities, and makes it more challenging for them to renovate, remodel, or do new construction. So we do support the proposal in the plan for the zoning changes, the design standards, increased FAR, the options for community benefits, where a property owner can come in and provide something of value to the city regarding the private realm in exchange for potential additional benefits in terms of height and FAR. So it creates a lot of flexibility and an opportunity to contribute something to the greater Smoky Hollow community. I did want to bring up one minor issue where we did have still a slight remaining concern, and it was not a subject that was discussed so far this evening. It's a very minor section in the code, but I think it potentially can be an obstacle both for the property owner that I represent and potentially many other businesses and property owners in Smoky Hollow. And in the desire in the plan, in the public realm, to enhance on-site parking opportunities and to solve a lot of the parking problem, one of the goals in the plan is to eliminate and reduce curb cuts, which would benefit in terms of being able to add significant increases to public parking on the street. The only challenge that we have in sort of the stage we're at in evaluating potential redevelopment of our property, and I think this applies to many properties, is that the existing plan design standards has provisions for buildings that have both, street access and alley frontage, where quite often there's required parking for the project that's accessed off the street. There's a building in the middle of the lot, and there's parking that's also accessed off the alley. The provisions that are proposed in the plan right now essentially require people that if they're doing new construction, which I don't see a problem with new construction, it's more additions and remodels, that they must take access to their parking completely off the alley and eliminate non-conforming curb cuts. The reason I believe this is an issue is that even though they allow up to 50% additions to buildings, there are many circumstances that may be unforeseen in terms of modifications, everything from ADA accessibility, the slopes and grades of those ramps that access driveways, changes that have to be made in order to widen sidewalks. And quite often, developers may choose to go vertical and add a story under the new plan and not necessarily demolish the building at the ground level. And so we see that as a potential obstacle, and would request that the commission consider adding a provision in the adjustment section that would allow for these kinds of extenuating circumstances where property owners could apply, say, for director review with appeal to planning commission, to consider those circumstances where a driveway may need to be maintained or slightly altered in design or slope or location or width. And there's no outlet right now for any administrative procedure as it's currently proposed. So that's the one minor thing we would ask for. But other than that, we think it's a wonderful plan, and we're very supportive of it and hope to see it adopted very soon.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. So your concern is that the elimination of curb cuts is mandated, and you're saying there should be some flexibility for the property owner because we don't know what might be best served on an individual lot.
Right, and I'm not saying that in all circumstances does it make sense to give an exception,
Right.
but right now there's no provision to even apply for and ask for one and be able to justify some extenuating circumstances. There's no outlet other than amending the general plan and the specific plan, and that seems rather onerous because you can't predict every circumstance that may occur in designing a project.
No, it's a very good point. I mean, the conflict is that's where we get our street parking, is by getting rid of those curb cuts. So it's kind of a balance of we want to do all these one-way streets, add all this street parking. But you're right, it shouldn't be mandated because then we might be creating unforeseen obstacles, I suppose.
For new construction, we don't have any objection. We understand it makes total sense. You're starting from scratch. You're demolishing everything on the lot. So you have to redesign, close up the curb cuts, and start over. It's sort of the middle ground where you're doing some addition and maybe doing more than 50%, particularly going vertical, because you're talking about adding building height and FAR. And you don't know what the particular characteristics of the building will be, if you have to make structural changes to meet building code or any of a number of other potential occurrent issues that may come up.
Yeah, and there's some grades in Smoky Hollow, especially off some of the alleys where parking in the back just is not going to make sense.
Right, and a lot of those sidewalks don't meet ADA requirements, and they have to be regraded, and typically Building and Public Works will ask for modifications to driveways, so I'm just not sure how that is going to be covered administratively. It's not spelled out explicitly, so my concern is how staff would address those situations, and you also can't rely on something that isn't spelled out in the code, that future staff is going to know if it's being handled in some ministerial way.
Okay. So Brenda and I met with you and the Sandstone group to go over their design project. For my own education, does the revised Smoky Hollow plan provide more flexibility than what Sandstone showed us? How does it affect what it was they showed us? Because what they showed us was under the old plan, I believe, correct?
Correct. The main difference is that with the addition of the community benefits tiering system, it just gives a more complete mechanism to ask for deviations and offer other benefits in exchange. As Paul addressed the fact that it's not limited to, but it can be open space, it can be parking, it can be doing some of the street improvements in the public realm that the city would like to achieve, say on Franklin, whether it be street furniture or moon earths or whatever the package of amenities are that they're looking to complete on a given block. So things can be offered up in exchange for those additional zoning benefits.
Yeah, well, for Sandstone, you can maintain that park a park, even though it's zoned for parking. The more green space we can get in Smoky Hollow, I think the better off the entire neighborhood will be.
Right. So we've evaluated the subsequent changes from the February/March draft and are supportive, absent the one minor thing that I've raised. And we support everything else that's in the plan.
Okay. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Pete Romano. I don't live in El Segundo, but I own 3 buildings that start on the corner of El Segundo Boulevard on Eucalyptus on the east side of the street. My concern, because I'm not seeing any detail in this one-way sort of approach to our streets now in the diagonal parking, what side is it going to be on? My concern is a self-serving one, of course. We're a service company to the motion picture business. We have studio trucks coming to our building 8-10 times a day. The loading zone that's in front of our building is crucial to our business, and I don't know what's happening here with street parking. So a little clearer definition of what's happening would be really great.
Great question, and I think it's something we talked about but didn't talk about in this public forum, about how it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but first of all, understand we don't have the funding to do much of anything as far as the street improvements that are in the plan. And as it rolls in from parking in lieu or other sources, I was told that they would meet with the stakeholders on a block by block basis and decide what's going to work best for your block, because we have different businesses, eclectic, different types of businesses.
Absolutely.
And so is that right, Greg, that there's going to be actual stakeholder input?
Yes.
Before anything is done?
Yes, that is correct. But another feature is we're going to try to target the improvements to the very area that generates the changes. So if your block doesn't change very much, it'll probably be the last one dealt with. And so you get to keep what you have for a long time. And even then, whenever we do identify a street that for one way, the first decision that has to be made is which direction. And that'll be based on what happened on the adjoining streets, if anything. And then the second question will be, would a block-wide community loading zone be appropriate, and if so, where, and things like that. And this would all be done in consultation with the stakeholders on that block, and it would be done on a block-by-block basis.
So from Main Street going east, how many streets are in the planning stages to go to the one-way section?
Can we show page 128? That's the map of Smoky Hollow with the streets with potential one-way. I don't know if you can.
Or 672, it's also on.
We're going to try to pull the map up. It's all but 2 or 3 of the streets, and I don't recall which ones exactly that were not included.
If you don't get the eucalyptus, I'm good.
The other thing to consider is that, are you north or south of Franklin?
We would be south of Franklin.
Okay. All the street segments south of Franklin are the most targeted, and north of Franklin would be a lot less important.
Of course. Okay, so that's great. It's a right off of El Segundo Boulevard to get to my building. Now, what side of the street park is the diagonal parking going to be on? Going to be on the west?
Right. It's all going to have to be case by case, because every street has different curb cuts already in it, and they'll try to maximize the side where you can get the most parking.
Okay.
But what would the procedure be? I mean, is the city going to send notice out to the entire block and saying, hey, here's what we're envisioning happening, one-way street, here's a public forum, come tell us your issues?
Yeah, we would try to have the public forum at the street. I mean, we'll go to them and set up a meeting for everybody on the block and discuss the needs and the proposed changes, and probably several meetings where we come up with preliminary designs and so forth. We don't have a procedure written into this, because it's, it could be different on every street, actually.
Well, there are curb cuts on both sides of the street.
Yes. And for the most part, when the angled parking goes in, we're not closing the curb cuts. We're going to work around them.
Okay, I guess it's the loading zone I'm really concerned. Right in front of my roll-up door.
Yeah, it's not our intention to create a great deal of hardship for any of the businesses, especially those that are already there. It's not our intention to do that. We'll try very hard to work with everybody and find the best solution that works for everybody.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
If there's a problem, Ms. Morono, just come back and tell us. We'll work with you on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any comments? Issues? Really? We don't get an audience this big and have nobody talk. All right. Going once. I'll close public communication. All further comments will come from the dais and from staff. Yeah, it was a good point Mr. Romano raised, and it's something I discussed with staff, like how will this roll out? And the idea, I think, of involving stakeholders is crucial with Smoky Hollow because we're trying to expand uses, not stifle or stunt anything that's already working over there. So remind me again what it is you're asking us to do. I know we're doing a zone text. You want us to certify the draft EIR.
Not certify, recommend.
Recommend it be certified.
Actually,
recommend that an EIR be certified that includes mitigation measures,
right,
statement of overriding considerations, and findings of fact.
Have you asked us to do that before on an EIR that's still out for comment? I can't recall a time where I've been.
Yeah. This is a different situation than the normal situation that you've dealt with. In most cases, when we circulate an EIR for public comment, we get comments and we are able to provide responses without having to make amendments to the EIR itself.
Right.
In this particular case, we had to do additional analysis. So that's one thing that was different in this case. But we've completed that analysis on the traffic impacts along the 101 freeway. We have consulted with Caltrans, the agency that made those comments, and we discussed how we've done our analysis, what the impacts were, and what our proposed mitigation measure is to address those impacts. They found that agreeable. So on that basis, we believe that we have virtually the complete record before you, because we don't anticipate additional parties providing many more comments that would trigger any substantial changes to this EIR that's before you tonight.
Okay. And I did notice the abundance of traffic numbers in the packet.
Yes.
Okay, so let's go back to the obvious desire of this commission to discuss the possibility of live work in Smoky Hollow. But I don't want to do anything that would slow down the progress already made for the Smoky Hollow plan as it is. So if you're saying the housing element is 3 years out?
Yes, it's about 3 years out is when it's due, so we'll be starting very soon.
Because I am hesitant about changing the Smoky Hollow plan in one meeting without talking to the school district, talking to, or at least figuring out how many potential new houses would be possibly created at Smoky Hollow. I mean, it definitely needs to be studied before this dais does anything out of the blue. And since it hasn't really been discussed in any of the public open houses, I'd be hard pressed to say, hey, we're going to make a change at this point. And those are just kind of my thoughts. I mean, I think it's a great idea, Brenda. I don't see why Smoky Hollow can't look like, those buildings right by the patio in Richmond, where you've got a little office downstairs and an apartment or townhome upstairs.
Exactly what excuse me.
Bless you.
It's exactly what they were meant to do, and I think that is a perfect fit for the Smoky Hollow area.
Yeah.
And yes, it does need to be looked at and developed, and if it's residential that needs to be looked at as well as for a particular area over there, that would just make sense to do at that time.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I just want to mention that the provisions in the plan for caretaker units will, to a certain extent, address the need for housing in the specific plan. I'm not suggesting that it will meet the entire potential need for that, but it does provide an avenue in those instances where a property owner or a business owner may want to consider that option.
Yeah, I know.
It can be
Consider and
used
use it.
creatively, that's for sure, yeah.
I mean, there's a way you can work around it, but if we're going to make big changes, let's make big changes. I hear from EDAC all the time. You know, people are like, there's not enough housing in El Segundo for me to relocate my business there. You know, there's no place for people to live. And Smoky Hollow, they would still be in our school district. You know, we don't have the Weisburn issue with Smoky Hollow. But again, I'm hard pressed to kind of make that kind of drastic of a change in the auspice of this type of meeting, especially since so much work and planning and meetings have already, so much input from stakeholders to kind of shape what we have. It seems like a dramatic shift to add that housing element at the last second. But those are my thoughts, guys.
How'd you come up with 500 square feet as a dwelling?
That was carried over from the existing code.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And it was, and the intent behind the size limitation is to kind of ensure that it is sort of the accessory use rather than the primary use.
Yeah.
What did council bump the ADUs up to, like 1,200?
Yes.
Yeah.
And what do we recommend, 800? 600? Yeah, well, there you go.
I agree with Ryan. I think that the staff and all of the stakeholders and the community have put a lot of time and effort into this. And I agree, I would hate to hold it up any further because we want to change one small element of it. And since I've been told, and I believe that's so, that this is something that is flexible, and I wonder if someone could come to the planning department and say, look, you know, this is my business, I'm married, I have a child, I want my living area to be larger. What would the procedure be if someone came to ask for that kind of a change?
If they wanted that sort of change after the Smoky Hollow specific plan update is adopted, it's a specific plan amendment.
Right, because right now it's prohibited. Caretaker is kind of like a little...
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's like a big studio. Yeah.
Strictly speaking, it's the same procedure now, but it would be kind of pointless in light of us about to change it to, I mean, you could change the existing Smoky Hollow specific plan too, but we're about to do that massively, so we would tell them, wait till this is adopted and then do it.
All right, so if we say we approve this proposal, we say, let's do it, and the city council says, yes, let's do it. And so in 6 months, somebody comes in and says, I want a larger dwelling unit as part of my building.
Yeah.
What happens?
That would trigger the specific plan amendment. We would start studying it. We would do the analysis and the CEQA analysis, and it would be before you in several months for consideration. And
so it takes several months, and then that would be a change to this document that would go forward. Is that correct? Yes,
and it would then go, if recommended by the Planning Commission, to the City Council for consideration, and then if adopted, it becomes an amended specific plan.
Well, I would think that is a reasonable thing to do, because I'm not aware of people banging on the door to say, I want to construct a 3-bedroom dwelling unit as part of my business. And I hate to delay this any further. There's so much work that's gone into it, including a second environmental study that Caltrans seems to have, signed off on. So I think it's a good plan.
Can this planning commission trigger that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we could actually ask that you go forward, even approving this document this evening, moving forward, making recommendations to the city council. Could this planning commission ask that you go back and study a live-work environment?
Yes.
What I would recommend is that as part of your recommendation to the city council, that you get the council's input on that as well. So you can make the recommendation that you're recommending approval of the specific plan and that you're also raising this potential live work, and then have council weigh in on whether they want staff to explore that further. So I would recommend that you include that in your recommendation to council.
Sounds reasonable.
Mhm.
Are you implying they're not watching this meeting right now?
Hi, Drew.
Only if they're trying to get to sleep anyway.
Okay, any other questions about the Smoky Hollow plan?
I think just going back to the housing overlay issue, would that also trigger, if you, based on the EIR that's been done, if you were leaving the overlay as is, has enough research been done through CEQA that you wouldn't have to go back and do that again? Okay. I'm very reluctant to remove so much acreage of housing when, to your point, we do hear from EDAC and from the community that attainable housing is a need. And I agree. I don't think that that's in the near term, but we don't know a decade from now, maybe even sooner than that, if those right now manufacturing industrial is the highest and best use there, but at some point in the near future that might switch, and rather than have to go back and initiate the process again, if we're just leaving the housing overlay in place, I'm not sure what the harm in that is.
We did that before on East Imperial Avenue. If you take East Imperial down towards like the Embassy Suites, there's that little strip of office buildings there. That was all zoned R3. And they had really hard time leasing those buildings because everything had to be illegally non-conforming. So when the zone changed, if they were selling walkie-talkies, then whoever you're renting to had to do some type of wireless. So it really restricted the property owner's ability to maximize the use of that commercial property. And those buildings have always kind of been commercial. And so we changed that from an R3 to make kind of like a tenant space, because we were getting complaints from the landlord saying, I can't find the person to fit in this tiny little box to rent this property. So if it's already developed, and remind me the area we're talking about.
So it's the northwest corner of Grand and Kansas. So you have multifamily that's now excluded from the plan.
Right.
That's going to change from MDR to R3. And it's immediately adjacent. So it's, I forget the auto repair shop that everybody goes to. And
Jim and Jack's.
Jim and Jack's, an International Rectifier. My understanding is that it's zoned currently manufacturing, but it has a housing overlay over it. So current tenant, future tenant wouldn't be restricted. It just creates an opportunity for somebody to develop it as housing. To your point, though, that might trigger some issues with adjacent property owners who now are, if a portion of the property goes residential, how that impacts their business.
Right.
Yeah, and I think live work is so much different and appropriate than
Residential.
than turning something into a bunch of townhomes. And it's if we can keep the live work component to it, keep it mixed use so that it's still.
Well, we could limit it to 50%. You can't do 100% housing. If it's live work, it's got to be 50-50, whatever the ratio is. But that's a future conversation we can have. We're talking about how housing would look in Smoky Hollow, or maybe people don't want housing in Smoky Hollow. You have to ask them.
Yeah.
And for me, this particular site is so far off of what is really the core of Smoky Hollow. I mean, it's adjacent to existing townhomes.
It's the
right
north
now.
side of the street.
It's the north side of it.
Yeah.
If I can inject two salient points there. We do know who the property owner is, and we've talked to them recently. They do not intend to develop housing, but they do intend to develop the property. That's one thing. The other thing is the process for activating that overlay requires a change of zone, which is not a whole lot more involved than doing a specific plan amendment, to be honest. So if you left it in, it would still require a discretionary permit process that goes through both this body and the city council. So it's not quite like because the overlay's there, it can just happen. It takes an active process to activate it. So my recommendation would be to not try to preserve that right now, but to definitely study that along with the live work option. And then we can move forward with the specific plan as it's proposed, but then consider in the near future what housing opportunities are desirable and possible.
Can I ask, the block between Franklin and Grand on Center, that giant pit in the ground. What can be done about that to better utilize that space?
Should we put housing there?
Well, put a parking lot there, you know, can we?
Below grade park?
We've been talking about that, not very seriously at this point, but there's been discussion about finding a way to cap it or build a deck over it and do something there. But it's part of the stormwater system, I guess, and so it has a function, and so we'd have to work with.
It's like a county property or something,
yeah,
right?
I think so. To work with them, and that's a long and arduous process, I'm sure.
All right. Okay, any further questions? Years in the making, you guys don't have more questions?
I have a concern. I have a concern about Franklin Street. And anybody go to the art walk on Thursday night? It was awesome. It was great. The main way to get to all the businesses on the east side is Franklin. I mean, it's a nice little street. There's less traffic on it. I do think it will become one of the best, one of the most significant spines in the new Smoky Hollow. You know, if El Segundo Boulevard is going to be shrunk down, it's going to be even harder to walk on it, harder to ride a bike. So Franklin really becomes a primary thoroughfare. Right now, you've got Franklin slated in two phases. There's a preliminary phase that paints some stuff on the crosswalks, which is nice. And then there's a future phase, which is then becomes a living street. And I wonder if maybe there's a middle ground. Do you immediately put Sharrows on Franklin? Because, you know, there's already some stop signs. I saw some Facebook parent network people freaking out because people are driving too fast on Franklin. They're not stopping at stop signs. There's already some conflicts happening. So if Franklin really becomes this multimodal intent of becoming a living street, I feel like we have to slow down traffic now sooner than later, rather than waiting for whatever the next the later phase of redevelopment is, which could be 10 or 15 years. So it's just an observation.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we approved this today, and it takes years for these plans to actually come into fruition.
Mm-hmm.
Could we get, and it doesn't have to be the next planning commission, but just an update from the progress of actually when they restripe the streets, how many bike lanes they've been able to add in pursuant to the bike master plan we have?
Certainly, we'll request that from the Public Works Department.
Thank you.
Are you asking what has been done to date?
What's been done and then what's scheduled to be done?
I know what's been done to date.
Right. That's your concern from last meeting.
Right.
That's why I'm asking about it.
Thank you.
Because we're told, we'll just, next time we paint a street, we'll just throw a bike lane in there. And I haven't seen a bike lane pop up yet. But, you know, that's one of those things, when they show up, people will start using them.
Absolutely.
And businesses will say, oh, look, this city's actually planning. They're planning, yeah. All right. So I want to just thank staff. I know how much work went into this type of plan amendment. You know, I was here back when it started, and it's been one of those things where people are like, what's going on with Smoky Hollow? And I'm like, we're working on it. So thank you. Happy to see such a high attendance at the Big Door open house. That's reassuring to see that the community is involved and invested, and glad to hear through you at least that it was overall positive response that you got from the stakeholders, because that's really the gauge of our success. Is we want this not only to work for all the residents, but those businesses who've decided to locate here into Smoky Hollow to make it work best for them as well. So appreciate the effort and the work that went into this. I know this is not an easy task at all. But let me ask you procedurally, would you prefer we make a motion on this now and then go to parking in lieu, or do them at the same time? Or Mr. King, you want to do one and the other and keep it clean?
You know, this is a separate agenda item, so I'd recommend that you make your motion now.
Okay. All right. Michelle, do you have any concerns or issues?
That have not already been addressed? No, I don't think so.
Don't mean to put you on the spot as the newest member here. Okay, if there's no further discussions, I'll accept the motion.
I'll give it a go, but I would also like to ask about what Ms. Christensen was asking. Can we discuss that?
Thank you for reminding me. So, Mr. King, you've had time to think about, I think was a pretty valid concern. I mean, I understand these one-way modifications and curb cuts are going to have to be dealt on a case-by-case basis involving those stakeholders who are directly affected. So I don't think it's unreasonable to have some type of procedure or mechanism or appeal process to say, hey, this doesn't work for my property and here's why. Some type of review process.
Yeah, we've had discussions with Ms. Christensen, and we agree that that would be appropriate. And I think that we were relying on the flexibility that's built into the specific plan to kind of carry us through. But she does have a valid point that, you know, the future planners and staff may not be seeing it that way. So I think it's probably appropriate that if there is a motion, that it direct us to just make that small change to include an adjustment process for driveways.
Okay, you got to be a little more specific than small change on the language you want for that motion.
No, but I say that, I don't mean that it, I'm saying that it's not a substantive reason if you don't feel that it is, that we would have to continue this and bring it back with the language. But if you want, we can do that as well.
No, I think you understand.
We do understand what the intent is of the commission to address that problem. And with your direction in the motion, we can make that adjustment before we take it to the city council.
Okay. And I think we have consensus on the idea of having that adjustment made.
Yes.
Right. All right. Brenda.
All right. I believe that I will make a motion to adopt resolution number 2837, recommending that the city council approve EA 1011, general plan amendment number GPA 13-01, zone change number ZC 13-01, and zone text amendment number ZTA 13-01 for the Smoky Hollow Specific Plan Update Project, as well as the addition to ask for city approval, director approval for the adjustment process for the driveways, and to include asking the city council for input and their recommendations on the live-work residential missing part of this specific plan.
Oh, we have a motion.
I second that.
Motion and a second in a second. All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, 5-0. Thank you, everyone. All right, that brings us to continued business, and our first item is zone text amendment for calculating building height. And we have a memo on this, correct?
Yeah, there was an older version of the draft ordinance that was accidentally sent out. So the changes were primarily on page 5. So I've attached to a memo on the dais a description of what the changes are. They're not substantive for most people. It's more of a clarification of a diagram, which I did send to you 2 weeks ago, I think. And then there's another adjustment where we threw in a few more exceptions and took one out for the height. It will mean a lot to some people, but not to most.
All right. Do we have a staff report?
Good evening, Chair and members of the Plan Commission. I'm going to present a zone text amendment for measuring building height. So currently, this exhibit illustrates how we measure building height on a flat lot. It's depicting a 2-story structure with a pitched roof. The height is measured to the average of the gable. And for pitch roofs, we allow 6 additional feet to the peak. So essentially, the slope roof is allowed 6 additional feet compared to a parapet, flat roof. Okay, so in an existing sloped lot, we would have, in this scenario, the living area starting from the highest point along the slope. And you measure height, and it follows the slope of the land. So it's parallel. And you have a penalty for the unusable area on the fill side. So I'm going to show another scenario. This one, you're cutting. You're measuring all again to the average of the gable or flat roof. And in this case, you have a penalty for the cut. So the proposed process for measuring building height, in this example, I'm showing two dots. One is the highest point adjacent to where the building walls will be located, and the second dot along the lower side of the slope is where adjacent to where the exterior walls will be located. This line represents the parallel line to the slope, and we're proposing, the code that we're proposing is an average between the highest and the lowest point along the slope. So the height is measured parallel, vertically, and this one shows like an overlap of both the existing and the proposed, but where the line is that's sloped and parallel is the old, and the new is parallel to the horizontal plane that is a midpoint between the highest point and the lowest point along the slope. So essentially what's happening is we're proposing a transfer of air rights from, oh, I went too fast, transfer of air rights from the higher portion to the lower level, so that the new process is going to be measuring the building height from this grade plane, and it's vertically directly above, and it's parallel to the grade plane. So here you could kind of see the overlap. All right, so you have another scenario where you have, and this would be very helpful when you have a very steep slope, or one that varies, that may be undulating. We would allow a segmented grade plane. And here we have two sections. So in this case, the high point where the cut is on the left, the red dot represents the high point, and the blue dot represents the low point. Height will be measured from this grade plane. We're defining it as a grade plane. And the height would be parallel and measuring directly, vertically directly above. And the maximum height would be parallel to that grade plane. So if you continue going down the slope, you would follow and continue the same process. So in this scenario, the high point is the blue dot and the low point is the red dot. And our new grade plane for this portion would be the dashed line that I just have had appear. And again, building height is measured vertically directly above the grade plane, and it's parallel to the grade plane. So why are we doing this change? It's simple and easy to calculate. There will be no impact on the flat lot. So for residential lots that are relatively flat, there will be no change. It solves the problem of buildings on slope lots, and it removes penalties for cuts and fills. And it adds as much as it takes away, because you're giving air rights from the higher portion of the slope to the lower side of the slope, so you have a balance. So the recommendation is the proposed ordinance is categorically exempt from CEQA, and staff recommends that the Planning Commission adopt resolution 2840, recommending that the City Council approve the proposed ordinance. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. So has this been an issue in the past with builders trying to determine what their heights were?
Yes. So we've had scenarios where the height right now is measured from the lowest existing grade, and it's the existing natural grade. So it's based on the grade that existed before the lot was developed. And as you know, we have properties that have been developed since the 50s, and not always has a survey been submitted. So we don't have the points along the whole perimeter of the property or where the height levels are adjacent to the foundation or a wall or a deck or any of that. So we have also had requests to have the director put some input or to say, hey, where's the height? Where are we going to measure height? Because we know it's been changed. We know it's different to all the adjacent properties. And we've had to go out, look at the site, and compare. And we've had scenarios where we determined that you can kind of tell that there's been a cut or a fill by just looking at the adjacent properties and also looking at where the grade is immediately in front, adjacent to the sidewalk. So it's very strict, and right now we're not able to measure height from anything other than the lowest existing grade. So if you have a slope, that's when you're penalized the most. So essentially you have to, if there's a slope, the building then would have to step down and follow the slope of the land. And when you step down, that means that not necessarily all the building will be at the same level. You would have to step down and go down steps, and people don't always want that. Or you have a situation where maybe you had a vision to have like a height on the roof to continue, but now it would have to step down. We also have scenarios where people want to add an actual pitched roof, and they had to do a flat roof with very little insulation. We're talking about 1930s, and we have to tell them, no, we can't do it. We can't approve it. There's no variance. There's no process. And we have people that want to add air conditioning now. So we also have a component that we've added where the director can make an adjustment. It's a determination where they could request 5 additional feet to be able to accommodate a pitch roof, insulation, raise the roof a little bit to screen the air conditioning unit and items like that.
Okay. You had me at simpler too, by the way. I mean, easier to calculate, great. You know, easier for people to understand, perfect. The more we can do of that with our building code, you know, the better off we are.
So, height restrictions are there for what reason? Why do we have height restrictions?
In residential zones, we have we're trying to control the bulk so that we have sunlight, ventilation. Right now, we allow in all 3 districts, R1, R2, and R3, 2-story with basements. And they have certain criteria that has to be met to be able to be defined as a basement. So it's primarily to keep a low profile. It's a scale that's more human.
Mm-hmm.
And in some of our commercial zones that are more neighborhood commercial, they have a different character. They could end up being a little higher. The downtown specific plan has a different bulk. It's a little taller than an R1 or R2. And then the further you go east, we have like along PCH now.
Yeah, a little
not-
higher than
no longer
26 feet.
Sepulveda.
Right.
Though those have more like a mid-rise, and it accommodates the uses that have that demand for larger buildings.
So in the existing method, you start from grade, and it's either 26 feet or 32 feet, depending on your roof type. And that's measured from grade to the top of that first segmented height. Is that right? So this new method adds this grade differential, gives you a place to average. So essentially, and that differential can be up to 6 feet. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, so we're allowing along the slope up to 6 feet differential.
So does that in turn mean that now the building height is no longer 26 feet to a flat roof? It's actually now 32 feet from grade, accounting for the differential. So in fact, we're allowing someone to make this building 6 feet higher.
The grade differential is it is the midpoint between the highest elevation and the lowest elevation where the building footprint is going to be located. Which of the 4 points, if we're talking about a rectangular footprint, we're not going to, you just have to select the highest and lowest. The height is still measured from the grade plane that we're recommending. We're just allowing 6 additional feet of a drop where you create your solid foundation where the living area is going to be located.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If I may, the answer is yes and no. On the low side, it will be 6 feet higher, but on the high side, it would be shorter. So there was one diagram where she showed the airspace that is actually lost to you currently. You can't develop that. That is just being transferred over to the other side. And so it does go up on that side, but it's going down on the other side. So it's a neutral impact.
Okay. All right. That's what I was looking for, and I thought that was how it was calculated. I just want to make sure that we're not just saying, hey, add 6 more feet to the height of your building, because it affects neighbors and things
And
like that.
it's important to understand that it's up to 6 feet, not guaranteed 6 feet. It depends on the slope. And if you have a flat lot, you get no additional. And if you have a very slight slope, you get a very slight additional. If you have a very steep slope, then anything above that 6 feet is going to be counted towards your height.
What if you have a neighboring business? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is the grade plane.
I understand.
Right here, and this is the differential right
Sure.
here.
So
as you can see here, if you could see it as a gain, on this side it's a loss. So we're just giving you 6 feet.
Net zero, right? So if you're a neighboring business, neighboring residence, and your lot steps down, so there's a retaining wall. So what happens to the neighbor who might be 6-8 feet below his grade? This guy's grade is this building now, 36 feet above the neighbor because of that 10-foot retaining wall that happens to be there? And does that factor into any of these height equations?
So you're asking if your neighbor on the low side, they're going to see 6 additional feet, yeah, possibly, if the slope is big or steep enough. On the contrary, the other side will see a shorter building.
Right.
So
I get that.
And yeah, I mean it is going to be a slightly taller building when you're looking at it from the low side.
I guess my question is, when there are big retaining walls that separate property lines, and when there's a retaining wall, someone's higher than the other person. So whatever that lot differential is, now you add 26 feet on top of that, and it's this looming thing over them. And do you ever calculate? Do you ever take into consideration difference in heights of lots in height consideration?
Not exactly. There are limitations on the height of retaining walls, and they have to be stepped in certain cases. So to that extent, yes, it's been taken care of. This is measured from the edge of the buildings, though, not from the property line. So it's a little bit of a distance, and
right, up to 8 feet or
whatever
like
the setback is.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I have seen several developments lately on slopes where you just have such height differences between the lots.
Yeah. Well, what we're trying to get away from is when you end up having those height differences occurring within your house, for example, it means you're devoting more of your interior to stairs and less to living space. And it's going to sound a bit jokey, but honestly, we like to live on flat surfaces, and our houses all have flat floors. And if the lot is sloped, you have to find a way to accommodate. And the reality is that anytime you do a cut on a lot, you're probably going to do a fill on the same lot because it's expensive to export. It's also expensive to import fill, dirt. So this is a more reasonable approach that acknowledges the reality is that you're not going to want to build a big deck and fill in the bottom because you're going to be penalized on the low end there. And you're also not going to want to build a big retaining wall and cut a slope out and get rid of all that dirt because you may end up with your front door on the second floor. Because the way it is now, we measure to either the lower of the natural grade or the cut. So if your first floor is substantially underground, that's still counted toward your height, and that doesn't make any sense. So this is just a way of sort of shifting it a little bit to a more realistic approach of cut and fill balance.
Gotcha. And that cut area can count as basement. That's not counted to 2 floors.
Sometimes it depends on how much of it is in the ground.
Okay.
Does this apply to all residential lots, no matter the width?
Yeah, this is the methodology for measuring. We're not actually changing the height in any of the zones. If it was 26 before, it's 26 now. So this just applies to how we measure.
Okay, because
yes,
sometimes these apply to only lots that are 25 feet wide and above. This is all lots.
This is all
residential.
Okay. This is all lots, residential, commercial, industrial, everything.
Great, thank you.
Any further questions? All right, thank you guys. I'll now open up public communication. Anyone wishing to address the dais on this, please step forward.
My name is Mark Telez. I do not live in El Segundo, but own multiple properties in Smoky Hollow. This height definition is of utmost importance to us, so we're appreciative that it's being discussed tonight in this forum. We have a large parking garage scheduled built. We're actually in the final rounds of planning 400-car parking garage in Smoky Hollow, and without the increase or the re-terminology of the definition, we can't build a garage because we can't get the FAR. Our property slopes from west to east 47 feet, and that 47 feet and what we just went through these definitions has a major inhibitor on how much FAR we can achieve. We can actually only get to 0.8 FAR without redefining how height is measured. So another thing we spoke about in the Smoky Hollow plan tonight, the objective is to keep the buildings that are there rather than tearing them down. And a lot of the buildings that are there have loading docks. Ours, in fact, has a 32-inch loading dock. So inherently, that's 32 inches above the natural grade. That is a penalty on us right now. Then you add in the slope, and before you know it, you only get to a 0.8 FAR, like I said. So the most important things, I just wanted to, we were talking about residential, and that's important as well, but on the commercial side, all these great things we're doing in Smoky Hollow, we can't achieve those great things without kind of not redefining, but defining it in a definitive manner. Thank you, Maria, for work, and we hope everyone says yes tonight.
Where are you putting your parking garage?
In between, if this gets defined, in between Oregon, Kansas, East Franklin, and El Segundo Boulevard. So when you drive west down El Segundo Boulevard, you see the large 1301 building that we just finished.
Yeah.
That's the slope, 47 feet that I'm.
Yeah. Well, Smoky Hollow is full of slopes. I mean, it's
it's like
a
well,
roller
that's the
coaster.
one that bothers us, right? So.
All right, thank you, sir.
My name is David Ballion. I do not live in the city, but my wife and I are desperately trying to move here. We think it's a wonderful place to live and work. My background, I'm an architect, and we've done maybe 10 projects in Hollow and Elevon and other parts of the city. And just wanted to add one quick thing, just so you guys understand how difficult my job is when I'm trying to explain to a client why the height is the way it is. So in theory, correct me if I'm wrong, if you build a basement that's quite low you could, in theory, be over your height limit completely below grade. That's an extreme example, but it shows you why the definition needs to change. The other issue is, as Maria explained, the topography of your lot. Just take that weird geometry and you raise it up. That's your limiting height. And since we all do like to live on flat floors, especially for commercial developments, it's some lots, especially in Smoky Hollow, are undevelopable because of this definition. So that's why I feel strongly that the definition of grade plane is an excellent idea. And in fact, every city around us has some version of that grade plane. And we quite literally researched Los Angeles, did Santa Monica, we did Long Beach. Every single one of them has a very easy definition, and I really strongly support we fix that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kimberly Christensen for Sandstone Properties. We also support the building height measurement ordinance and believe that it will solve a lot of problems. Also, again, in Smoky Hollow because of the extreme topography in many locations. And it will actually also benefit in terms of the quality of design and the way buildings are designed in terms of size and scale and massing and how that integrates with the design standards. It's not just only about building height and FAR. So we think from all those perspectives it will be helpful, and we support the ordinance. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, we'll close public communication. All further comments will come from the dais. Any further comments?
No, it makes perfectly good, logical sense to me.
Seems like a good idea.
Simpler is better.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, I'll accept a motion.
I make a motion that we adopt resolution number 2840.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, 5-0. Thank you. That brings us our next continued business item is agenda item I-4, parking in lieu fee program for Smoky Hollow. And we did have a staff report last time. Does anyone wish to have another staff report on this issue, or?
No, nothing has changed.
Yeah.
As presented last time, we can go through the presentation again, but we've decided we probably had enough presentations. So.
And you, we're not
Well,
debating the amount that is a city council
That is
jurisdictional question.
Yes.
You're just asking us as part of the zoning to help fund the parking we want to do. Is this a program that the commission agrees should be implemented?
Yes, that's correct.
But the details get worked out.
The price will be worked out by the council.
Okay. All right. Comments?
how about our newest commissioner?
I actually had the pleasure of being here when this was presented at the last meeting, and I paid very close attention, so I'm good. Thank you, though.
Okay, well, I'll open up public communication. Anyone wishing to talk about the parking in lieu program for Smoky Hollow, please step forward. No? Kim?
Come on, Kim.
All right, seeing no one come up, we'll close public communication. Yeah, parking in lieu in the downtown has its advantages as well as those who are not a fan of it. But I do overall believe that it provides more opportunities than it creates obstacles, in that it allows a developer to pay for which that they cannot physically provide. And without something like parking in lieu, the city would be forced to say, no, you can't build what you want to build. You can't develop your land in that way because you have to give us 5 spots. So, you know, as far as the price and what's reasonable for that, leave that to city council. But I think that the parking in lieu program is something that's needed if we're going to change Smoky Hollow the way we want to.
I'll agree with you, Ryan. I think that this just segues into what we just did earlier in the meeting, and it's just, you know, one small piece of the puzzle of parking in lieu. We've experienced it in the downtown, and it as it's proposed here seems to have its benefits, and I'm sure that the city council will make a reasonable judgment, as reasonable as can be. But it is that one added element. How are we going to provide parking for the needed changes that are happening? So I'm in favor.
My only question is why it's capped at the first 159 stalls when there's still such a shortage of units after that. Are we limited to that, or could we say?
I think it's all they could physically figure out would fit on the street, and you can't raise more money than you actually need. So it's not so much the dollar amount as it is the amount of public parking we can create. So the program will stay in effect as long as there are parking spaces to be built or added under the program, whatever dollar amount that is, because construction costs change. But we're not allowed as a city to collect fees for things we don't need money for, if that makes sense.
It does. There's no reserve fund for future parking structure. No. Okay.
No.
That answers that.
No.
With any luck, there will be, but of course, it's not been hugely successful, and I think it was sort of implemented back for the downtown in a way that was sort of when things were sort of beginning to happen in the downtown area, and I think it was implemented to allow that to sort of begin, and I think that's what needs to happen here for Smoky Hollow.
And then does staff trigger when the first so many stalls are put into effect, or is that something that has to come back to commission?
I think they're going to do it on if they have someone who paid resources on a certain block, then that would be the block that gets the first development.
Ideally.
Yeah, ideally.
It
in a
may not
perfect
be
world.
perfectly like that, but yeah.
Right.
And that can be determined by staff. That doesn't require this whole process again.
Yeah, it'll be done at staff level in consultation with the stakeholders on the street we're working on. It would not come back here. It's a design issue. It really is an engineering issue at that point.
I think that's an important point, just to make sure that residents of Smoky Hollow understand that we actually drafted language in there that says they're not entitled to, just because they pay the in lieu fee, does not mean that they're guaranteed to have parking in the proximity of their property.
Oh,
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah, that's
Important
really
to
vital
know.
that people understand the way it works.
Well, and to that end, I have a question about funding. It's on page 646 of the packet. It says use of funds. Funds collected by the city for such payments must be deposited into a separate fund and can only be used for acquiring, developing, and maintaining parking. I get that, but part of the issue is how do you study parking in general? How do you encourage more people to take the bus? How do you encourage more people to take public transportation? How do you encourage people to walk? And so can some of those funds also be used for these living street ideas, where you're actually discouraging driving and in turn helping to solve the parking problem?
It's a little bit murky, and it's not as clear-cut as building parking spaces on the street. And so we've tailored this to focus on what we know is absolutely permitted to as a way to expend those funds. Those other ideas are not being cast aside. The specific plan encourages those approaches. We also are contemplating in the near future working those into the municipal code citywide, or at least in the commercial zones. There's a lot of components to it, so we're trying to decide what the parameters will be, or whether we're going to do this as a big omnibus, take it or leave it kind of thing, or take it piecemeal. There's a lot of consideration. This could be something that we work on over the next decade.
I have no doubt. Yeah.
But I do predict that within 2 years we'll be before you. Probably a lot sooner, with some of those ideas as code amendments.
All right. Any further comments or questions? No? All right.
I make a motion we adopt resolution number 2827, recommending that City Council approve environmental assessment number EA-1198 and zone text amendment number ZTA-17-06 to establish a parking in lieu fee program for Smoky Hollow.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, 5-0, thank you. All right, and that brings us to report from Planning and Building Safety Director Designee.
We don't have a report this week.
All right, and the upcoming agenda, thank you for this.
Yeah.
Underwater tunnel plugs, that sounds fascinating. Can't wait for that July 12th. Learn all about that.
Side adventure.
All right. Planning Commissioner comments. Welcome, Michelle.
Yes.
Great job.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Way to pay attention and ask questions.
happy to be here.
We're happy to have you with us, Michelle. Look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
All right, any other comments?
I have a question and a comment.
Okay.
Question is, I know the RFPs for the lakes have come in. Does that ever come towards Planning Commission again?
The RFPs, no. That'll be
So it goes right to
decided by
council.
the city council. However, depending on which proposal is selected, there's a high probability that there will be general plan amendment specific plans and changes of zone and zone text amendments and conditional use permits and AUPs. And all this. Just,
We get it.
we went through this with the Topgolf. It'll be,
I remember.
yeah.
We had a meeting last night for the Lakes Task Force where we evaluated the 9 proposals we have. Those are all being made public.
Mhm.
I think they're being posted on the city's website if they're not already. And then we have interviews for 5 coming July 11th and 12th, which will also be public hearings. And they're not really interviews as much as they are presentations.
Is that here?
We're trying to put them here and trying to get them broadcast on the television because the idea for the RFP is, you know, they're all public meetings, public process until the city council takes it over and actually starts a contractual negotiation. So the idea is we selected 5 of the 9 for presentations. They'll come give the presentations, and then after that, the task force will reevaluate and just make recommendations to city council. But I believe city council has the right to look at all 9 and you know, take the recommendations from the task force as just what they are, just recommendations. But ultimately, the city council will be selecting from amongst the 9 which they think is the best fit for the city.
And one last comment, just going back to the art walk last Thursday night. I want to give a big shout out to George Renfro and the Arts and Culture Committee, and to the city for helping to make it happen. So it was a great event, and it just made me proud to live in El Segundo.
All right, well, that brings us to adjournment. Our next meeting, July 12th, 5:30, these chambers. Thank you, everyone.